Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel, MR.Creepy N. So today's video is definitely going to creep you out. In this video, we're getting into 4 true winter horror stories. The kind that happen when it's freezing outside, you think you're safe inside, and something proves you wrong. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. If you enjoy this kind of content, make sure to like the video and subscribe. Alright, let's get into tonight's stories. I've been a traveling nurse for 11 years. I stayed in more short-term rentals than I can count. Furnished apartments, extended stay hotels, basement suites, rooms in strangers' houses. You develop a kind of thick skin for unfamiliar spaces. You learn to sleep in beds that aren't yours, to cook in kitchens where nothing is where you'd put it. After a while, every new place just becomes a place. I stopped feeling unsettled by them years ago. That changed last January. I was assigned to a rural hospital about 40 minutes outside of a small town in northern Minnesota. The housing coordinator had set me up with a private room in a large older home. The owner, a woman in her 60s named Margaret, rented out 2 of her upstairs rooms to traveling workers. She seemed warm enough when I arrived. She showed me the room, pointed out the shared bathroom, told me the Wi-Fi password, and mentioned that the other room down the hall had been empty for the past few weeks since the last renter left. She didn't elaborate. I didn't ask. The room itself was fine. Older furniture, clean enough. A radiator that knocked and hissed through the night the way old radiators do. The window looked out over a flat white field that ran all the way to a tree line, maybe a quarter mile back. Nothing remarkable. I unpacked, set up my work schedule on my laptop, and went to bed early because I had a 5 a.m. shift. The first 2 nights, nothing. I slept fine. The radiator knocked, the wind came off the field, and rattled the window frame. I barely registered any of it. The third night was different. I woke up at 2:17 a.m. I remember the time because I looked at my phone immediately, the way you do when something pulls you out of a deep sleep and you're trying to orient yourself. I didn't know what had woken me. The room was dark, the radiator was silent for once, and it was cold, colder than it had been the previous nights. Not dangerously cold, but noticeably different. I pulled the blanket tighter and lay still for a moment. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint, just barely there, like wet wool, like a coat that had been out in the snow and brought inside without being hung to dry. It was the kind of smell you don't consciously identify right away. Your nose registers it before your brain gives it a name. My chest tightened before I understood why. I lay there without moving. The room was completely silent. Not quiet, the way a room is quiet at night. Silent in a way that felt applied, like the air itself had gone flat. I told myself the smell was coming through the vents. Old houses circulate strange things. I'd stayed in places that smelled like their previous occupants for weeks. It made complete sense, but I didn't move for a long time after that thought, and I couldn't tell you exactly why. I eventually turned the lamp on, looked around, and saw nothing out of place. The door was closed. The window was closed and locked. I cracked the door and looked into the hallway. Empty. The door to the other room, the vacant one, was closed the way it always was. I stood there for a moment, listening to the house. Nothing. I went back to bed and told myself I was tired and overreading things the way you sometimes do at 2 a.m. 4 nights later, I worked a long double and came home exhausted. I showered, ate something I barely tasted, and went to bed just after midnight. I was out fast. I woke again at 2 a.m. Almost exactly no smell this time, but the room was colder again. That same drop that had nothing to do with the thermostat. And there was a sound. It was so small, I almost missed it. A single soft sound, like the floor settling, but localized, specific. It came from directly on the other side of my wall, the wall that shared with the empty room. My hand, which had been reaching for my phone on the nightstand, stopped halfway there. I hadn't decided to stop it. It just stopped. The house was completely still. Old houses settle. I told myself that 100 times in 100 different places. Wood contracts in the cold. It makes sounds. There was nothing on the other side of that wall, but I didn't reach for the phone again for almost a full minute. I just lay there with my hand suspended in the dark, listening to a silence that felt like it was listening back. I turned the lamp on, I picked up my phone, I sat up in bed and I stared at the wall. Nothing happened. I opened my door and stood in the hallway. The door to the vacant room was closed. Same as always. I stood there maybe 10 seconds before I walked to it and put my hand on the handle. The metal was cold, colder than the air in the hallway. I opened the door. Empty. Bed frame. No mattress. A folded moving blanket on the floor in the corner. A single window. No one. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, then went back to my room. 3 days later, I was sitting downstairs in the morning before my shift and made conversation with Margaret. I mentioned that the cold in the upstairs hallway seemed worse near the vacant room. I kept it casual, just a comment about the insulation. She looked at me for a moment before she answered. She said the last renter had asked to leave his contract early. Didn't give a reason. Just paid out the remaining weeks and left one afternoon while she was out. All his things were gone when she got back. She said she still didn't know why. She said it like she was telling me the weather. She did not ask me why I was asking. I finished my contract 7 weeks later. I told the coordinator I preferred not to be placed. I grew up ice fishing. My father took me out on the lakes every winter from the time I was 6 years old, and by the time I was in my 20s, I was going out alone without thinking twice about it. I know the ice. I know how it sounds when it's safe and how it sounds when it isn't. I know how to read the color of it, how to check the thickness, how to find the good spots. It's not a hobby for me. It's just something I've always done. I say that because I want to be clear that I'm not someone who spooks easily out there. I've been alone on frozen lakes in the dark more times than I can count. Nothing about it has ever frightened me until 2 winters ago. But it was a Saturday in early February. I drove out to Lake Henning, about 25 minutes from my house, a mid-sized lake I'd fished probably 50 times over the years. I got there around 4 in the afternoon, knowing I'd be staying past dark. That's normal. Ice fishing at night is quieter and the walleye move better in low light. I drilled 2 holes about 30 feet apart, set up my portable shelter over one of them, dropped my lines, and settled in. For the first 2 hours, everything was exactly as it should be. I caught 2 small walleye, released them, drank coffee from my thermos. The temperature outside was around -8. Inside the shelter with the small propane heater running, it was manageable. The lake was silent, the way frozen lakes are. Not peaceful exactly, just empty. A complete absence of sound except for the wind occasionally dragging across the ice. Around 6:30, the wind stopped. I noticed it the way you notice when a fan you've stopped hearing suddenly turns off. The absence of it was loud, somehow. I looked up from my line. Through the small ventilation gap at the top of the shelter, I could see that the sky had gone fully dark. That's when I felt it. A low, slow unease that started in my stomach and moved upward. Not the cold. Something else. The kind of feeling that arrives before any reason for it does. I stayed still and listened. Nothing. The lake was completely flat and silent in every direction. I told myself I was tired. I'd worked a long week and hadn't slept enough. Your mind finds things to worry about when you're exhausted. I knew that, but I turned my lantern down slightly anyway. I couldn't tell you why. It just felt wrong to be that visible. About 20 minutes later, I heard something. It was a sound I recognized. The sound of a hand auger drilling into ice. That slow, rhythmic scraping rotation. Unmistakable once you've heard it 1,000 times. It was coming from somewhere out on the lake to my left, maybe 80 to 100 feet away. My breath shortened before I decided anything about how I felt. I sat completely still inside that shelter. The drilling sound continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. I waited. I assumed it was another fisherman setting up late. It happens. People come out after dark. Nothing strange about it. But then I realized I hadn't seen any headlights on the access road when I'd been watching the sky 10 minutes earlier. And this lake in February, on a weeknight, I had been completely alone for 2.5 hours. I hadn't heard a car, hadn't heard footsteps on the ice. Whoever it was had arrived in silence and was now sitting in the dark on an open frozen lake with no visible shelter and no light source. The scraping sound started again, then stopped. My jaw tightened. I didn't say anything to myself that time. There was no explanation that formed. My chest just went still, and my hands set down my rod on their own without being told. The silence that followed was total. I waited 3 full minutes without moving. Then I slowly unzipped the shelter about 4 inches and looked out toward where the sound had come from. I could see the ice clearly. There was a moon, and it reflected off the surface enough to see a fair distance. There was no one visible in the direction I was looking, but there was a hole in the ice, fresh, black against the white surface, no skimming of new ice over it yet, which meant it was recent, maybe 10 minutes old, and there was no one next to it. I pulled back inside. I sat still. I did not move, did not make a sound. The propane heater ticked quietly. My breath was coming fast and shallow, and I was working to slow it down. A person drills a hole and then disappears on a flat, open, moonlit surface where I would have seen them walk in any direction. I gave it 2 more minutes. Then I packed everything, rods, thermos, heater, as quietly as I could manage, killed the lantern, and walked back to my truck with my gear. I did not look behind me the whole way, not because I was panicking, because I had made a deliberate decision that I did not want to see what was behind me. Lel, I told my wife a modified version, that I'd had a strange feeling and packed up early. She accepted it. She knows I don't usually do that. A week later, I went back in daylight to check the spot. I found my 2 original holes, both skimmed over with new ice. I found the 3rd hole, the one I hadn't drilled, about 90 feet to my left, exactly where the sound had come from. The ice around it was disturbed in a way that told me someone had been. I want to start by saying I'm not a superstitious person. I'm an engineer. I spend my days working with measurable things, load calculations, material tolerances, structural limits. I believe in what can be verified. I say this because what I'm about to describe still doesn't have an explanation that satisfies me, and that bothers me more than the experience itself. My mother passed away in November, 3 years ago. She'd lived alone in the same house for 31 years, a 2-story farmhouse about 2 hours north of where I live. After she died, the estate process moved slowly, the way those things do in winter. There were legal delays. The house sat empty for almost 2 months before anything could be formally done with it. In January, I drove up alone to begin sorting through her belongings. My sister couldn't come that weekend, and I wanted to get started. I'd been in that house hundreds of times. I knew every room, every sound it made, every draft that came through the kitchen window that never sealed right. I was not walking into an unfamiliar place. I was walking into my mother's house, which I thought would make it easier. It didn't. I arrived late afternoon. The driveway hadn't been plowed since her neighbor had done it the week after the funeral, as a kindness, so there was a flat layer of packed snow over everything. I let myself in with her key, which I still haven't taken off my keyring. The house was cold, not dangerously, but uninhabited cold, the kind that gets into the walls. I turned the heat up and started in the kitchen, which felt like the most manageable place to begin. For the first hour, I was fine. Sad, but fine. I boxed up dishes, sorted through her spice cabinet, found a grocery list in her handwriting on the counter that I folded and put in my jacket pocket without thinking about it. Then I went upstairs. The moment I stepped onto the 2nd floor landing, something shifted in me physically, not emotionally, physically. A tightening across my shoulders, the kind your body produces when something in your environment has changed and your nervous system registers it before your conscious mind does. I stood at the top of the stairs and looked down the hallway. Everything was exactly as it always was. My mother's bedroom door at the end, slightly open. The bathroom door on the left, closed. The small linen closet on the right closed. I stood there and breathed through the tightness and told myself this was grief. I'd read that grief does strange physical things, makes you feel watched, makes familiar spaces feel altered. I was alone in my dead mother's house in January, going through her belongings. Of course, my body was responding. That was completely understandable. I went to her bedroom and started there. I worked for about 40 minutes, folding clothes, stacking things in boxes. The room smelled like her. That part was hard, but I kept working. I was kneeling next to the bed, sorting through items in her nightstand drawer, when I heard the front door. Not the door opening, the door settling. That specific sound an exterior door makes when the temperature outside shifts and the frame contracts. I'd heard it 1,000 times in that house growing up. I knew exactly what it was. My hands stopped moving inside the drawer. I stayed kneeling, completely still, and listened. The house was silent. It's a sound the house makes, I told myself, especially in the cold, especially when the heat is running and the outside temperature is dropping. Wood moves. It always has in this house. I knew that. My hands knew that too, apparently, because they didn't go back into the drawer for a long moment. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, on the first floor, moving from the direction of the entryway toward the kitchen, not running, not shuffling, walking with weight and intention, the way a person walks through a house they're familiar with. I did not move. My breath left me and didn't come back right away. The steps continued across the kitchen floor, then stopped. I was on my knees next to my dead mother's bed, and the only thought I had for the next several seconds was a completely blank refusal to process what I'd just heard. Then my mind started working again, and I grabbed my phone off the nightstand. I stood up. I crossed the bedroom to the door. I pushed it open wider. I looked down the hallway toward the stairs. Nothing. The hallway was empty. The light from the kitchen was reaching the bottom of the stairs the way it always did. I stood at the top and listened to the house for a full minute. Complete silence. I walked downstairs. I checked the kitchen, checked the front door. Locked. The deadbolt I'd thrown when I came in still in place. Checked the back door. Locked. Every window on the first floor, all of them still latched. No one was in the house. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, and then I looked down at the floor. There were wet marks on the linoleum near the back entry. Not puddles, just faint dampness in two places, the kind of pattern boots leave when someone comes in from the snow. They were already mostly dry, like they'd been there for 10 or 15 minutes. My throat closed. I looked at the back door again. Locked. No signs of tampering, no broken frame. I stood there until I could breathe normally. Then I took photographs of the floor with my phone. Then I left. I locked everything behind me, and I sat in my car in the driveway for almost 10 minutes before I was ready to drive. I called my sister that night and told her what happened. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that I've turned over in my mind many times since. She said that our mother's neighbor, the one who plowed the driveway, had called her 2 weeks earlier asking if anyone had been up to check on the house. He said he'd seen a light on upstairs one evening and assumed it was one of us. We hadn't been there yet. I went back in the spring to finish sorting her things, daytime, with my sister. We didn't discuss it while we were there. I still have the grocery list in my jacket pocket. I've washed the jacket twice. I keep finding it and putting it back. I don't know what walked through that kitchen. I'm not sure I want to. I've worked land surveying for 14 years. If you don't know what that means, practically it means I spend a lot of time outdoors, in places most people never go, property boundaries in the middle of nowhere, undeveloped parcels, miles from the nearest road, rural land that hasn't been touched in decades. In winter, that work doesn't stop. Deadlines don't move because it's cold. You dress for it, you carry the right equipment, and you do the job. I'm not someone who gets rattled by isolation. I've worked alone, in remote areas, in the dark, more times than I can count. I carry a GPS, a satellite communicator, and I always file my location before heading into anything genuinely remote. I've been doing this long enough that the work itself is almost meditative. Just me, the equipment, and the land. What happened 2 winters ago was the first time in 14 years that I left a job site before finishing. The parcel was in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, a large undeveloped tract, around 400 acres, that a developer had commissioned us to survey before filing a subdivision plan. My partner on the project had come down with something the day before, and rather than push the timeline, I told him I'd handle the eastern boundary section alone. It was a long day's work, maybe 10 hours, and I'd be finishing in the dark. but I'd done it before. I knew the terrain from the preliminary maps. I had everything I needed. I drove a Forest Service road to the access point and started at 7 a.m. The day itself was unremarkable. Cold, overcast, maybe 8 inches of snow on the ground, but nothing that slowed me significantly. I worked the eastern tree line systematically, setting markers, recording measurements, moving through the timber at a steady pace. By 3 p.m., I was about 2/3 through and feeling good about the timeline. That's when the light started going. Winter in the UP. The sky starts changing around 3:30, and by 4:30, it's effectively dark under heavy tree cover. I switched on my headlamp and kept working. This is normal. I've done it hundreds of times. The trees thin out a bit along the northern stretch of the boundary, so visibility was manageable. Around 5 p.m., I stopped to log some measurements and eat something. I found a downed tree, cleared the snow off it, and sat down, opened my pack, poured coffee from my thermos. I noticed the woods had gone very quiet, not the gradual quiet of evening settling, sudden quiet, the kind that happens when everything that was moving decides at once to stop. I'd noticed that before in the field, usually when a large animal was nearby. Deer, occasionally a bear, in warmer months. The birds stop first, then everything else follows. Your brain registers the pattern before you consciously name it. I set the coffee down on the log next to me. I didn't pick it back up. My eyes moved slowly across a tree line ahead without me deciding to scan it. Just a slow, automatic sweep. Dark trunks, snow, shadows between them. Nothing visible. The beam of my headlamp reached maybe 40 feet before the dark absorbed it. I told myself it was a deer, almost certainly a deer. This parcel hadn't been developed. Wildlife moved through it constantly. A deer had probably crossed nearby. The birds had flushed, and in 30 seconds, everything would go back to normal. I waited. It didn't go back to normal. The quiet held for a full 2 minutes. My coffee was going cold next to me. I hadn't touched it again. I became aware that I was sitting very still, and that my stillness didn't feel like a choice. Then I smelled smoke, not campfire smoke, cigarette smoke. Faint but unmistakable. Here in an undeveloped 400-acre parcel, 5 miles from the nearest structure, at 5 p.m. in January, the back of my neck went cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. I stood up slowly. I didn't call out. Something in me decided very clearly and very quietly that calling out was the wrong thing to do. I clipped my pack, picked up my survey rod, and turned my headlamp off. The darkness was immediate and total. I stood completely still and let my eyes adjust. Gradually, the tree trunks separated themselves from the dark. The snow on the ground gave off just enough ambient light to navigate by. I waited and listened. 60 seconds in, I heard it. A sound to my right, maybe 50 feet into the trees. Not a branch, not an animal. The specific compression sound of a boot stepping into crusted snow. That hollow, deliberate crunch that has weight and intention behind it. One step, then nothing. My chest locked. I did not move. I did not breathe for a moment. I stood in the dark between the trees, and I waited for a second sound, and it did not come. One step, then silence. I thought, a person out here has a reason to be out here. Hunters use private parcels all the time without permission. It's trespassing, but it's common. This was probably someone who'd been cutting through this land for years and had no idea it was being surveyed. That was reasonable. That made complete sense. But a hunter would have a light.